Joe, and to the whole JNF community. It's really an honor to be back here. And I not only am a friend of JNF, a longtime friend and admirer of your work. So I want to start by thanking everyone who's here on the line. I want to provide you now with a brief update from the latest developments of what's going on. And we are now on day 40 of this war with Hamas. And right now I'm coming to you from Tel Aviv, but I just got back about an hour ago from the communities and the kibbutzim along the border with the Gaza Strip. And I was there with a group on Route 232, which we've now sort of given it the name of the road of death, the road where so many of the terrorists attacked civilians on October 7th, the road where the Nova Music Festival was taking place. And on a personal level, it was a reminder for me 40 days after of why we are here and why we are doing this. And our goals here are very clear and haven't changed from the beginning, which is to eliminate Hamas, to eliminate all of Hamas's terror and terror supporting capabilities, and to bring back our hostages, all 239. We are deeply distressed about their well-being. We are thinking about them, as I'm sure all of you are as well, constantly. And I feel that in any briefing that I give, it's so important for me to just start with the perhaps obvious call, which is the fastest way for them to come home is for Hamas to release them immediately. And I call in every opportunity I have for anybody in the international community, anybody in any sort of position of influence, and just individuals to put pressure on elected officials to call for Hamas to release them immediately. Our military activities and ground operations are continuing in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. We are making significant progress there. We're talking about fierce close quarter combat between IDF soldiers and Hamas terrorists in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. At this stage, unfortunately, 46 IDF soldiers and officers have been killed in action, and we are thinking about their families and their heroes. There's really no other way to describe their contribution. But the progress is significant. We have struck at this stage more than 15,000 Hamas targets in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. We've destroyed 300 tunnel shafts. We've come upon and destroyed hundreds of booby-trapped buildings. 3,000 sort of terror infrastructure sites have been destroyed. Hundreds of rigged sites with explosives. And we're targeting the top brass of Hamas. So most recently, we're talking about the head of the anti-tank missile array in Khan Yunis, as well as the head of Hamas military intelligence. So we are targeting their senior leadership, but also down to the very last terrorist who was involved in the attacks or potentially involved in future attacks on Israelis. I want to also talk a little bit about the activities in Shifa Hospital, which is perhaps the latest update in terms of what is going on the ground. And we know now for more than a decade that Hamas has been using civilian locations exactly like Shifa Hospital, other hospitals in the Gaza Strip, as well as schools, mosques, community centers, really anything you can imagine that is a civilian site, Hamas has been using for terror activity. And that includes Shifa Hospital. Starting yesterday evening and through the day, the IDF has been engaged in very, very precise, controlled and limited activities in the Shifa complex. It's important to say that we are not targeting any of the patients who are in Shifa, any of the medical teams who are there. We're operating in completely different areas of the hospital complex with the goal of finding the terror assets that we believe to be there and to make sure that Hamas can no longer use it. We've also brought in medical aid, which includes incubators for children who are being hospitalized in Shifa. And along with us as well came medics and Arabic speakers to make sure that we are delivering the message to the civilian to civilians in the hospital as much as possible. Now, the activity in Shifa comes after our activity in the Rantizi Hospital, which is a children's hospital in the northern part of the Gaza Strip as well, where we found significant Hamas assets that under no normal circumstance would you expect to find these kinds of assets in a hospital. So we're talking about RPGs, explosive devices, a tunnel that went from the home of a Hamas senior leader adjacent to the hospital into the basement of the hospital, solar panels that we know were bringing power into that area as well, and unfortunately, what looked to be evidence that that hostages were being held in the basement of Rantizi as well. Now, both of these examples are clearly violations of international law that Hamas has done, and we anticipate that there'll be other civilian locations that we will come upon and that we will have to investigate that Hamas is also using. In terms of the humanitarian efforts that we are taking in the Gaza Strip, there are many, and these are really concrete steps that we're taking to try and minimize the impact on civilians. First, now for several weeks, we have been calling on civilians in the northern part of the Gaza Strip to move to the south. At this stage, more than 900,000 civilians have moved from the north to the south, and we're delivering that message in several ways. First, we've dropped more than 1.5 million pamphlets in Arabic urging civilians to move from the north to the south. We've sent sort of 6 million voice messages instructing people to move, sent 4 million text messages, and made 20,000 individual phone calls instructing people to move. So you can really see by the scope of the efforts that have been made, the goal is to get people to move, and we continue to encourage people to move. And we're doing that through local pauses that are taking place every day, in which we're facilitating the movement of civilians from the north to the south. Unfortunately, Hamas is making that difficult, and we saw earlier in this war that not only was Hamas discouraging civilians from moving to the north, from the north to the south, but they were also resorting to violence to prevent that movement. They were placing explosive devices along the route and doing other things that were preventing civilians from moving. So at this stage, IDF forces are actually securing the evacuation corridors and making sure that Hamas won't interfere in the movement of civilians from the north to the southern part of the Gaza Strip. The humanitarian aid that has been discussed is going into the Gaza Strip every day. At this stage, more than 1,300 trucks of humanitarian aid have gone into the Gaza Strip. We're talking about 8,000 tons of food, nearly 3,000 tons of medical supplies, and a constant stream of water that is being brought in to the Gaza Strip, with the hope, of course, that it will go to civilians and not be used by Hamas. I want to say also a few words about the situation in the northern part of the country, as this is really another front that is a focus of our attention. And we're seeing really with every passing day that the situation on the ground becomes one of almost a multi-front situation. And we see that in the last month, Hezbollah has been involved in several attacks against Israeli civilians and soldiers by launching missiles, mortar fire, and attempted infiltrations into Israeli territory, which is something that we're seeing on a fairly regular basis at this point. The IDF is responding forcefully to those attacks. And from the first day, we've been sending Hezbollah and all of the other terror organizations on our borders and the countries that harbor and sponsor these terrorist organizations a very clear message. And that's a message to not get involved in what is happening. And we're joined in that message by our allies in the United States. And the message now is one I think that even goes a step further, which is a direct call to Lebanon, which is, do they want to be, do they want to be responsible for the consequences that they will face if they get involved in this conflict? We're seeing that they are very quickly slipping into a scenario where they will pay a very heavy price for their defense of Hamas. We think that for their own interest, it is better for them to not get involved and to exert control as the sovereigns in Lebanon on the situation in the south, as in southern Lebanon. But we will respond as necessary. And it's very clear that the reality on the ground there is going to have to change in some regard. We have thousands of Israelis who have been evacuated from the border with Lebanon, and we need to make sure that they will be able to return home and to live safely and securely and not under a threat coming from Hezbollah in the north. So we are monitoring that situation very, very closely, as we're monitoring the situation really on all of our borders. But the focus largely remains on Hamas. And we understand that attempts by Hezbollah or other terrorist organizations are to some degree an attempt to distract us from what is going on in the Gaza Strip. And we won't be distracted by that. And we'll deal with whatever threat we need to face head on and do whatever we need to do to defend our public and ultimately to bring back our hostages. But that is the latest here on the ground operationally. And I'm happy now to answer any questions that you may have.
Well, thank you so much. One question that has come up is, in addition to, as you've mentioned, reaching out to our representatives and others in the government and getting together in mass rallies, as you saw yesterday, what can we here in the U.S. do to help get the message out about what the IDF is doing and how it is acting so professionally and humanely in this effort to root out terrorism?
Yeah, I think it's a really important question. First, I think that, sadly speaking, I think that memories are short. And as I part of my role, I work with and I interview and I speak to news outlets and reporters all day, every day. And attention spans are short. And I think that as this war continues, perhaps the public is forgetting how this whole thing started and why we are even in this war in the first place. And I think that keeping the memories of those who were killed alive is so important. And attaching names and faces and stories to the 1,200 people who were killed is really critical. And it's amazing the degree to which people forget that. And I found myself, even in interviews, having to remind reporters how this started in the first place, and to emphasize that this is not a war that we started. This started on October 7th when Hamas massacred our people. And we need to remember why we are here. We need to remember their stories. I think a constant rallying cry for the release of the hostages is absolutely necessary. I don't envision any scenario where we could possibly pause what is going on without calling for an immediate release of the hostages. And I think really speaking to everybody within our own communities, within your communities, and to pose a really simple question, which is, if we want to end this, Hamas can do that very easily. They can release all of the hostages, they can surrender, they can abandon terrorism, and then we would not be in this conflict. But until we do that, we have to fight. There is no other option. And we're taking extraordinary measures as we are fighting. And I think just reminding people of this, whether in our, in your personal community, in your professional community, wherever it may be, is absolutely necessary so that this truth is not lost.
Thank you. One last question that's come up. Here in the U.S., we are seeing a much more effective effort on the part of the IDF in Israel in getting that message out. Having done this 9 years ago and now today, after this horrific massacre, what have you seen as the biggest difference and the most effective changes that's occurred to get that message out from Israel to the rest of the world?
Wow, I could speak for probably hours on this. I'll try to be as concise as possible. I think there are a few aspects. I think one, I was already down. I've been in reserve duty since October 8th. I think my first day down south was probably October 9th. And it was very dangerous. I mean, it was an active war zone. And I think bringing people, reporters, heads of state, leaders, to the sort of the scenes of the battle on Israeli territory as soon as possible. I think that was absolutely necessary, despite the very obvious danger that was involved in doing that. I think showing the level of depravity that Hamas exhibited and showing really graphic footage and images in a secure and controlled way to reporters has made a significant difference. And I think really being on the front lines of the battle in Gaza and bringing reporters in there with the troops to see what Hamas is doing. And I think in some regard, we are so motivated by what happened, and we've always been motivated. But I think the sense here of the attack that we feel is unprecedented, and I think that's coming across. And I think if in the past, people would in a silly way almost, didn't understand why it was justified for us to attack Hamas because they were launching rockets at us. Now it's almost personal when they tell us or they question our justification. And I think that we're making that clear in every communication that we have. And I think when people see it here, it becomes a lot harder to question why we're acting in the way that we have to act and why we have to defend ourselves.